Hi, welcome to Boxes and Labels, our International Dance Day panel as part of the Dance Center's International Dance Day events. I just want to introduce TomoeArts. It's a dance theater company that mostly works and practices and plays in Vancouver, Canada. And Vancouver is on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. And just before we start, I know that the three of us on the panel and all of you are likely from various places and right now could be anywhere in the world. So I would like you all to just take a few seconds to think about where you find yourself right now and the history of that place and your place in that history. So we're going to start with some self-intros. I am Colleen Lanki. I am the artistic director of TomoeArts, and I'm the organizer of the Vancouver panel in the Redefining the Contemporary Symposium. And this symposium, it happened in December, and it was originally planned. I planned it to be an in-person gathering of the dance community in Vancouver, or some of the dance community. But of course, due to the pandemic, it moved online. And because of Pamela's involvement, it really grew into this amazing international 3-panel event. And it also has grown into an ongoing research project. So this International Dance Day talk is kind of a summation of some of the main points of that December event, these 3 panels that discussed, full of dancers that discussed these topics. And it's kind of a summation, but it's also some of our own ideas, assessments, and some of the questions that were raised and maybe things that we can take moving forward. And so now, Pamela.
Thanks, Colleen. Hi, everyone. My name is Pamela Santana. I am from Peru, from the capital, Lima. I am a dance researcher, artist, teacher, working right now in Lima. I was the coordinator of the Peruvian Roundtable, and I currently work as an independent researcher, and I am involved in projects of dance and intangible cultural heritage. Kavya?
Good evening, namaste, bonjour, hola, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kavya. And originally I'm from the south of India, but I grew up in the east in Kolkata. And currently I am based in Paris. And I am working as a research assistant for an Indian arts and culture strategy company in Mumbai called the Artex Company. And apart from that, I also work as a freelance artist, dancer, choreographer, and performer in Paris at the intersection of various Indian dances. And I was the organizer of the Indian panel of the Redefining the Contemporary Symposium. So, without further ado, as Colleen mentioned, we're going to dive straight in to give some of the key insights which emerged from each of our panels. So, let's take a flight and hop on to India first. So, the panelists that I chose for the Indian panel were keeping in mind the fact that I wanted to represent the diversity of dances that exist in India and just the vast variety starting from various folk, classical, traditional, contemporary, across the spectrum, the dances that exist. I wanted to kind of shake it up a little bit and try to represent even the ones which are usually not given the kind of importance that they should be given. So the representation of folk was very important for me on this panel. So before I dive in, I just want to pick out some important quotes that came up from my panel discussion. As artists, if we want to think outside the box, we first need to know what is in the box. I asked myself, does it work for the context today? Isn't the term contemporary a marker of relevant art created in the present and a response to situations in the current times? So then, can't contemporary art very well include work that is created within the classical idiom? It is about the past in the present, developing a sense of history in the now. The kind of parameters within which the contemporary very often happens is kind of contradictory to how they earn a living. So as you can see, even just from some of these quotes which come from the panelists on the session, there's a huge diversity of views which was expressed. And what was contemporary for each dancer and how they expressed it was situated very deeply in the social, historical, and political contexts within which each of the dances evolved, each of the dances that they represented. And a lot of what came out was also the compromises and challenges that each of them faced in navigating through these usually siloed terms or forms. So let's look at Meher Malik, who was a belly dancer from India. For her, contemporaneity or bringing the contemporary in belly dance was about dissociation of identities. And by identities, she meant the fighting against of stereotypical notions of what belly dance is usually traditionally associated with, such as, she wanted that belly dance is not only defined by her hair and body and skin and costume, but also by the history and the quality of the dance form. So for her, contemporaneity was about dissociating from stereotypical or often backward notions associated with the dance. Let's move on to Divya Ravi, who was a Bharatanatyam dancer based in the diaspora in London. And she was of the opinion that often contemporary and classical are seen as two ends of the spectrum. Contemporary is seen as something very improvisational, fluid, and versatile, whereas classical dances, at least in India, are often steeped with connotations of, oh, it's too archaic, or oh, it's too intellectual. We don't really understand this. So for her to bridge this gap, to kind of try and make the two ends of the pole meet, was where her contemporary kind of stood. And thus for her to make art that was relevant to society, that spoke to people, that people could relate to, for example, on topics of veganism, for example, on topics of feminism, but while still using the Bharatanatyam idiom, the kinetics, the form, not moving away from that, but concentrating on the themes or the relevance to society was what contemporaneity meant for Divya. And let's come to Hannah, who works with a folk dance and theatre form in the south of India called Kattaikootu. And for her, the folk has often acted as the counterpoint to the modern Tamil stage. So it's almost as if the folk has a burden to remain authentic, kind of as a juxtaposition to everything that is contemporary and modern. So their approach, the Kattaikootu Sangam, the organization, their approach was to mix something which is usually considered traditional, which is their folk form, to mix it with a classical Carnatic Tamil form, and to present something contemporary. So in a way, it was trying to amalgamate the traditional and the classical to present something contemporary. So for her, contemporary was about changing with the times, about bringing in, for example, women to play roles that have been usually played by men, or by adapting folk theatre forms, which are usually done in a village, for the stage. How do you compress an entire night-long performance to something for the stage for an hour? So these were the kind of challenges, and the economics behind it that she brought out were her main ideas about contemporaneity. And lastly, we had a Kathak dancer called Sanjukta Wagh. And for her, contemporariness or contemporaneity was about the compositeness of Indian dance form. So for her, it's not only about the dance, but it's also about the music, the lights, the whole package in a way, the use of the stage. So she was trained in Kathak, but when she trained in the Laban school in contemporary dance, it helped her to rethink her approach to the classical via the lens of contemporary. And she was of the opinion that the word classical often denotes a hierarchy in India. So do we kind of need to get away from these words, or are these words important, but they need to be redefined, which is what we are trying to do today. So just to end, I think the three words had very subjective notions from each of the dancers, but at the end of the day, it was a safe space for all of them to kind of express what each of them saw as contemporary in their dance field. So I'll stop there and I'll pass the baton on to Colleen to talk about Canada.
Right. Thanks, Kavya. Yeah, the initial question that I had asked when I first started this a long time ago was the difference between classical, traditional, and contemporary. And it's interesting how traditional and classical becomes a kind of a binary too. That's an aside. Anyhow, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Vancouver panel. And I just want to make sure that, I'm not presuming to speak for any of my panelists. And in fact, I was actually one of the panelists. So I have a little kind of a conflict of interest in a way. I was the organizer, but I was also one of the panelists. And that, I wanted to have this discussion, which is why I set it up. So I just want to encapsulate some of the main ideas that came up rather than attribute them specifically to one of the dancers that were on the panel. Now, the Vancouver panel, we brought together mid-career and senior dance artists that work in 4 different dance disciplines that are generally labeled with the term traditional or classical. I had Sujit Vedya in Bharatanatyam, Margaret Grenier, who does First Nations dance, Leslie Telford, a ballet dancer, and myself, Colleen Lanki, or Fujima Sayu, who practices Nihon Buyo. And again, that's also an interesting addition, having me, not a non-Japanese person who practices a Japanese art form. And honestly, the gathering was pretty selfish. These are all artists I really, really love. And I respect them, and they honor their practice and they experiment in their dance forms. The mix also reflects, to a certain extent, the mélange that is the Vancouver dance milieu. It's really a mix of wonderful different dance styles, although I realize there are many, many omissions. I could have had a huge panel. Ballet was an important addition for me because I really want to kind of problematize or point out that ballet is also a classical art form with a traditional lineage, and that often gets forgotten because it's Western and European art forms are not necessarily classed that way. And so we discussed how these labels of traditional or contemporary affect our practice, the way our work is programmed, funded, and perhaps viewed by audience members. And some of the main points that arose from the panel were summarized rather beautifully by our moderator, Scheherazade Cooper. And she summarized 5 points: erasure followed by reclamation or reconstruction, usefulness or harmfulness of terms and taxonomies, the tensions in the idea of authenticity and between appropriation versus appreciation, individual rigor and practice, and forced heteronormativity in some of the dance forms. And we had an amazing post-panel discussion with our guests. We had an incredible audience and we just had a wonderful talk. And this talk really created more questions than it gave answers, but it raised a lot of points. And between that and the talk, I just want to focus on 2 major themes. One is relevance, which Kavya was also speaking of. And some of the points that came up around the word relevance are, if contemporary, small c contemporary here I mean, means of the now, in scare quotes, then our job as dancers in any art form is to remain relevant. So if we embody contemporary, small c, practice, using our trained or inherited lineages, our dance forms, then all of our dance actually becomes political. Dance is a practice or vocation, and we're stewards of that artistic practice. Our relevance comes from passing this practice and a view of the world to others. So that's one way relevance can happen, just in holding and passing and teaching and maintaining and passing along. Also in this idea of relevance, we had a discussion of dance living in imaginary worlds and the value that that might have. We also spoke of the circular rather than linear view of history, and that we're always dancing in both the past and the present while continually creating the future. So that ultimately means some of the meanings behind traditional and contemporary and that separation, it ultimately might make that meaningless if we look at that circular form. The other main theme is belonging, the idea of belonging. So the question really arose of, how do we belong in a dance form? How do we belong in the local or greater dance ecology within that form? In order to ensure space for this belonging, do we need fewer labels or more labels and more varied labels and taxonomies in order to expand that capacity to belong? Is belonging available on different levels? And by this we meant, or, this was something that I really wanted to talk about. Could we belong as a professional performer? Can we belong as an amateur performer? Can we belong just through practice? Can we belong just through appreciation? Maybe that appreciation is through doing or watching. So how do we belong? And one of an example of this is, perhaps one might think a professional ballet dancer or a Bharatanatyam dancer perhaps needs a certain body. That means a type, a gender, ethnicity, able-bodiedness, age. I'm not saying it does, but I'm questioning, because some people do think that's the case. But the question is, there room for belonging for everybody, for on other levels of practice? Anyhow, so those are 2 main terms. Lots of other things came up, but I will stop there and I will pass it on to the fabulous Pamela.
Thank you. So the Peruvian Symposium featured 3 dance artists with a long artistic trajectory: Antonio Vilches, Luz Gutierrez, and Carmen Roman. And these 3 artists, I chose them because I thought they were exemplary for this type of talk. The 3 of them are critical about classifications in dance. The 3 of them work in the frontiers of what is usually perceived as traditional and contemporary. They mix and play with styles, genres, formats, and times in pursuit of a known language, which is at the same time a pursuit of an identity in dance. An identity that is problematic because, as it was concluded in the symposium, dances are reflective of our own struggles and challenges as citizens of this country and as people of certain ethnicities, places, and cultures. Dances and classification of dances reveal deeper and ingrained classifications in our Peruvian society. The experiences and claims of the 3 participants led us to the problem of diversity present in our country. We experience a negative recognition of our diversity, that is reflected in how dances are defined, classified, positioned, and communicated in spaces of education and artistic practice. We are inhabitants of a complicated land with a complicated history, with a strong legacy of colonialism. Historical and social fractures and divisions are still very much alive within our society. Traditional dances are still associated to the rural, the indigenous, or peasant communities, and thus experienced as less refined or elaborated. And perhaps this is why still the notion of traditional is associated to the past, the old, and the unchanged. Acknowledging the predominance of Western dances in the world of dance, it could be argued that some traditional dances in the Peruvian context still battle for a place in the arts field instead of the heritage field. The hierarchy is evident, and we continue to perceive traditionally based dances as frozen cultural elements, as historical expressions that do not change or evolve. Classification becomes discrimination when these fixed notions do not allow us to see dances and artistic expressions from traditional cultures as contemporary work or creation. As seen in the Peruvian Roundtable, also classifications lead to exclusions in dance practice. To artists working outside a fixed category or within categories, it's common to experience exclusion and unequal opportunities in professional settings of dance practice, the cultural market, and even funding options. Antonio provided a great example when explaining his experience of exclusion. His company, which works in the mixture of traditional styles such as zapateo with Western dances such as tap or contemporary dance, was denied participation in contemporary dance festivals for being considered too traditional. At the same time, they were also denied participation in folk dance festivals for being considered too contemporary. Because the medium of the dance is the body, classifications in dance genres are easily mixed with classifications of bodies, ethnicities, and identities. Thus, in and through dance, we may perpetrate the same racism and discrimination we do as a society. This has led to the construction of hierarchies between dance genres and the creation of dance ghettos, where people fight over who can dance specific dances, over which dance is better, or over which body is more fit to dance. Antonio also illustrates this argument through his experience of practicing certain dance traditions where his body image, his color of skin, or his facial features did not correspond to those commonly expected in the dance. He experimented a feeling of not belonging or not being authentic enough to perform certain forms. To work between disciplines in dance has led him to ask, what peoples do I belong to? But a rigid view of tradition does not only come from audiences and contemporary artists and practitioners. Sometimes are the same artists working within tradition who have these stiff views. This is translated in ways of teaching that overlooks the plurality of bodies and the plasticity of the body, that sees dancers as mere reproducers of all forms and dismisses an understanding of the body as a medium of exploration and self-discovery. Luz illustrates this reflection through her account of an experience directing a folk dance group. Dancers had been classified according to the dance's regions of origin, leading to a classification by body image and ethnic features. Those who look less indigenous and dance better were selected to perform dances of the coast. In contrast, those who had more indigenous features and were considered to have less opportunities as dancers were chosen to dance dances from the Andean region. Dancers who represented the Amazon region were scarce. As a result, dancers placed in a specific region were not able to dance dances from other regions. And this is an interesting example because it reflects a national problem where dancers are embodying classifications that reinforce hierarchies and distances among people and bodies. In a shot, dancers were embodying the stereotypes that divide us as a country. However, through dance practice, there is also the possibility to counteract stiff notions and divisions about dances. Each panelist has developed a proposal to overcome classifications and solidifications of concepts in dance through practice. Antonio, through the integration of different dance styles and music styles, using dance as a medium to reconnect with ancestral, spiritual, and indigenous healing practices, such as Carmen, or interweaving past and present times using movements, rhythmic patterns, and ways of expression of traditional forms as a source for today's bodies, as Luz In this artist's works, dance beyond categories is a space for creativity, risk, to fight heteronormativity, racism, and especially to celebrate diversity. Their definitions of what it means to be contemporary and traditional in dance are inclusive to diverse practices, approaches, bodies, and identities, and they themselves embody the merge and mixture of different legacies, honoring past traditions to create new ones. And that's it.
Thank you. So I think it was amazing to see the differences, the similarities, the use of air quotes. I think a lot going on here. So just to lighten up the mood a bit, as you might, dear audience, as you might see, we've tried to capsule in a lot of different ideas in this short period of time, but we thought we would do something a little more informal, a little more fun to celebrate Dance Day with you. So I now invite game mistress Pamela Santana to introduce you to our little game, the 3 colored boxes. So these were the 3 colors which represented our panels as well in December. So each of us have chosen a word which we felt was important in relation to this topic. But we don't know which color has which word. So we're going to pick out a mystery word from the box, and each of us are going to do a little bit of a rapid fire kind of brainstorming discussion on whichever term arrives. So let's go for the first one. Colleen, do you want to choose a color?
What color? Okay. I'm going to pick the blue because it was the color of our panel. I don't know.
You're also wearing blue.
And I'm wearing blue. Identidad. Okay, about identity.
Okay.
Who wants to start? Identity.
Perhaps first. Yeah, I'm just thinking how these tensions between traditional and contemporary are so much influenced by, also in the Peruvian case, perhaps more by a sense of identity that's really related to a view of identity, but a very, very classical view of identity as fixed, as unchanged. So perhaps this idea of traditional being related to the past, rural communities, and the ancestral. So perhaps there is a view of identities as something that does not evolve, does not change, which kind of fits this tension between what is contemporary and what is traditional.
Yeah,
just an idea.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I also, it's almost like I want to pose a question because this might Kavya, well, both of you might be able to respond to this as well, is the idea of a dance form creating identity. And of course, dances can do that. They're community celebrations, they're cultural celebrations, they may express stories, religion, histories, all kinds of cultural, definitively important cultural material for particular communities. And in diaspora, I think some people grab these dances as a way of reassessing or reconfirming their identities. And then when somebody from outside, perhaps a particular look or sphere or culture or language group or whatever, wants to take part in those dances, there is tension. So, one of the questions I posed is what happens when some of these dances jump borders? Yeah. And they jump nations and they jump cultural groups. What does that do to the form? What is, how, it's a huge question because, you want to protect the culture, but in the other sense, you want these dances to be practiced and loved and grow. Any thoughts on that, you guys?
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head, I must say, because I've been facing this as an Indian expat in France, kind of. So I've been dealing with this quite a bit. I just wanted to touch on a small thing before responding directly. Even when Pamela and I were studying the masters in Choreomundus, when people would say, why don't you introduce yourselves? And for the first few months, we were doing that a lot. Yeah. So everyone would say, hi, my name is, for example, I would say, hi, my name is Kavya, and I am a Bharatnatyam dancer. So it's like, and Bharatnatyam is one of the 8 classical dances of India. And it became almost kind of like this rote learned kind of, okay, I have this ready fixed thing to say. But then we started taking a step back, and we were all like, is this how we identify ourselves, with just this one marker, with just this one dance, with just this one way of identifying ourselves with the dance? And coming to your question about jumping borders, I think I've had very mixed experiences here. One is, of course, yes, people assume just because I'm Indian that I do yoga, that I do Bollywood, that some of these things are very taken for granted in a way. And at the same time, I've had some very warm, welcoming responses as well. But just thinking in terms of how much of the traditional versus the contemporary part of the dance do people want to learn and know about? I think it's been quite challenging to navigate that, because some people want to learn it exactly the way it is, but for some people that doesn't work. They want something more contemporary, something more relevant, something more new, something they can relate to. So there's always kind of that challenge of finding the right balance between the two. Do you want to add any other thoughts?
Yeah, perhaps going back to this idea, Colleen's question, because I don't have an answer, but how can we see cultural elements as something that, it's something that it moves. It's something that you take with you wherever you go, wherever you are. So how can we just attach it to a territory or a land, or it's not, it can be contained. It can't be contained. We are a proof of that. Our experiences are a proof of that. And we have migrations, people moving, movements of people around the world. So culture is something that we take with us. And in this process, it changes, it's alive. So it fits from our neighbors, from other experiences. So I understand the idea of something we want to preserve and to be authentic, but at the same time, it's like going against the current, because it's something that it's alive. The medium is the body. So we express it, so we live, and it has an element of the past, but it's also lived in the present. So it's constantly infusing from other elements and other references. So I know it's a very hard and tricky and problematic question, but I just want to stick to this idea of how can cultural elements not change, and moving and migrations are the diaspora. It's part of this.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And sharing, and
Yeah.
and how uncomfortable does it become when one's perceived identity is not perhaps the cultural practice or the form, and so this the phrase, perhaps certain bodies shouldn't dance certain dances, I find really, really, really disturbing. I find it really disturbing, because it just, I think of, that current ballet dancer in Germany who had a costume mistress who kept, telling her she shouldn't be there because she's Black, or, people who aren't allowed to practice because they don't look right, whatever that means, more scare quotes. What does right mean? So anyway.
And I think we're talking about identity as in identities of people, but I was also reflecting on the identity of a dance form. Like, can we flip it and talk about, the belly dancer said, belly dancer's identity is, it's vulgar, it's promiscuous, it's sexy, it's supposed to, so even dances have identities in a way, not just us and how we relate to dances, but even dances have these often stereotypical kind of identities. I think we'll take a break on this first one and move on to our next box if we are ready. Dun, 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 dun.
Kavya can pick. Kavya pick.
Yeah, I'll pick. Okay, I'll go for Peru, the color of Peru, pink. Aha! Contemporary with a big C. We know who's starting this one.
Yeah,
Colleen.
so this is, yeah, so that was that. I just really want to problematize the difference between the words big C contemporary and small c contemporary. And it is something that came up in the conversation and multiple times in our panel, just as, it sort of skirted around as like, how do we use that word? Because it is the name of a dance form that is often considered not a form, yet it's of course a form, but it's supposed to be everything, and it's like this is self-expression, and you can do anything. Can you do anything as a big C contemporary in contemporary dance? And does big C contemporary dance as a proper noun have a lineage? Well, of course it does. It's it's a European lineage, and it has all kinds of historical precedents, and it's a really big topic. So what falls into that huge bucket of big C contemporary dance, and then what's left out, and how does that affect programming, especially in dance festivals? Pamela brought that up with the dancers. It's not contemporary dance, big C contemporary dance, but it's also not this. So that's what I'm problematizing, is the idea of the form contemporary dance using that word. Perhaps it needs a new title. we can change it up. What do you guys think? How does that, I know that Pamela studied big C contemporary. So.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest problems. And even when I was in the master program, I remember our teachers very questioning also what was contemporary, and how one of the first questions was, how do you define contemporary? Yeah. And they were like, it cannot be defined. You cannot. So whatever answer we tried, because some of us were coming from contemporary dance, it was very difficult to define it. And so it's like a big umbrella, and you can put everything there. And well, I guess one of the characteristics of contemporary dance is also this openness to dialogue with, or to merge with other disciplines, urban dances, ballet, etc., etc., etc. In the Peruvian case, I would say, because I study, I can only talk about my context where I study. One of the characteristics, and perhaps today now I can see it as a critique, right? It's there was not an attempt to bridge dialogue with Peruvian dances, what we understand here as traditional Peruvian dances. So there was not an attempt to bridge those dances. So in my entire career, we didn't practice with Peruvian music styles, for instance. Progressively in the program, we had perhaps one or two in Peruvian dances in the program, but there was really not an attempt to dialogue. And I think this now, as I see it, it's a loss for us as dancers, because we have such a rich tradition of styles and forms. And one of the critiques contemporary dance here receives is that it's not Peruvian, or where is the identity of the Peruvian contemporary dance, which differs from Kavya's example that we talked the other day, where India has like a more identity, contemporary dance that fits more from Indian culture, whatever, such a big thing. But I think in Peru, this is one of the critiques we receive a lot as contemporary dancers, this lack of dialogue with other forms, especially with Peruvian dances.
That's really interesting, because actually, Colleen, I must admit, this difference between big C and small c, I have realized that it exists, or I became aware of it only after you've pointed it out during the symposia. Because I think in India, like Pamela very correctly mentioned, I would agree that there are two quite strict streams, in the sense that one is the big C contemporary, where you're like enrolling your child, or you're going for a big C contemporary dance class, and there's a very set syllabus of what you're going to be learning. And like you're saying, there's a lineage, there's a training, there's a structure. So it's quite defined. On the other hand, Indian contemporary with a small c is a melange of contemporary, the idea of fluidity, all of this, with elements of Indian classical / traditional dances, like Pamela mentioned. So personally, for example, I have for 2 years of my life been a part of a contemporary dance class, and I remember very well that there was not much space for improvisation, really. I mean, this idea that it's usually you can do what you want, Colleen, like you were saying, it was not really like that, and there were quite some strict rules on what needs to be done and stuff like that. And I must say my theoretical knowledge about what that big C contemporary is might be much lesser than either of you, but I am now beginning to see that there is quite a dichotomy there between the big C and the small c.
See,
Yeah.
maybe without that term, you'd never have noticed and it wouldn't matter. That's an issue. But yeah, the hegemony of an assumption of a Western form, which it is predominantly, a Eurocentric form, big C contemporary dance, as the assumption that it's the standard. It's kind of like humanism looks at the white male body as the standard for human. Well, it's almost like the standard for dance becomes a ballet lineage into what's now, modern and contemporary. And that's really simplified. And I think there might be a dance scholar or two listening who will go, what? No. But it's something that I've thought about. And I just read the book Heat and Alterity by Ananya Chatterjee. And she really problematizes what contemporary dance is, and how if you're doing something like you would consider Indian contemporary, it might be classed in a programming way as ethnic or not big C contemporary, not contemporary enough, sort of like some of the work that Pamela was describing as well. So, it's interesting. And there we go back to, do we get rid of that taxonomy, or do we just need to expand it? Do we just need to make it just much bigger? I don't know, but it's a thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's start this
term?
one. Yeah. Sorry, Pam, you don't have a choice. But
Pamela doesn't have a choice, but she got to play with the box.
Yeah, we go for the yellow box. Accessibility. Okay. I can go first on this one. And I think we both, Pam and I, spoke about it a little bit, even which came across quite strongly in our talks. I feel about who actually can do these dances, who has access to the resources, the training, the infrastructure, the funds, the grants, you name it, who has access to, to be part of the traditional or the contemporary or the classical. And just to provide some context, I mean, in India, I think each of these are also quite, the access to each of these dances, I must say, is also quite restricted. It's quite classist. I would say that a lot of the classical dances are usually studied by those who have, the resources to actually go to a guru and train for many years. And, because all of it is done outside the school, whereas the traditional dances, and Colleen, you pointed this out very well, in India, classical and traditional, I think, are also quite problematic terms and not always understood similarly. Actually, not at all, because we clearly say we have 8 classical dances, and that itself is such a huge marker of access, because your class, like many people say that you're giving a classical status to these 8 dances. So in a way, there's a very clear hierarchy of that these dances have a higher status than the others. Whereas the traditional, like in Pam's case, in India, is also often related to the folk dances, the regional dances, for example, like Bhangra, or, like all of these fun kind of dances which are done, which originated in the rural areas. And of course, a lot of them have become more urban due to, the trends and etc. But a lot of it of course, the access depends a lot on who has the power, and that's the power hierarchies in society. I would say. So, have y'all kind of experienced any of this in your country?
So perhaps I can talk a bit about my context. So I would like to give an example, perhaps. So I study in one of the two universities I live in the capital. So the capital is very different, but mainly universities are concentrated in the capital. So we have dance programs only in two universities. And this happened around 2013, 2012. So it's when we first started to have dance in university programs. So the professionalization of dance. And I studied in a campus where we had, before having a career in dance, we had like a school of dance, contemporary dance, and we had like a center for music and Peruvian dances. And these two buildings were living in the same campus. Not so far away, but actually really far away in an ideological sense of not talking, not interchanging, there was not dialogue among students or teachers or common projects. And in this university, contemporary dance became a specialty in a faculty of performing arts. So students who go to study contemporary dance, they can have a degree, they can have a professional career in dance, and they can have a degree. And the ones who want to study Peruvian dances and music styles, for instance, in this center, they just have it as a parallel to their careers. So the center, it's in the same place, and then you see the progression of dance into academics and these places where they are more legitimate. They're legitimate. They become more legitimate, and they grew and they go into academics, while the other sphere is still there, right? So you can have an idea of these hierarchies in this single example.
Right. Interesting. Okay, there's you just reminded me of the University of Hawaii, where I did my MFA in theater, actually. But they have an amazing dance program that is predominantly contemporary based, but there's also dance classes available to everyone in Korean dance, in hula, in Japanese dance, in Okinawan dance, in a number of different forms, and music. And there is a real sense, and there you can actually do a degree in hula now, which is something you can actually get a master's in hula. But of course, it's Hawaii. But the other forms, even though the dancers they're really intermingled. A lot of the contemporary dance majors take these classes, and theater people also. Theater and dance are quite intermingled there. It's quite remarkable. It's a little bit of an oasis, yet still the dance is embedded in the ethnomusicology department, the dance of Okinawa and Japan. And so there is still, even though it's quite an oasis of intermingling and wonderful capacity to learn all of these things, and openness, there's still this division where there's the contemporary work, and then there's this ethno choreology or ethnomusicology section. And that, it's interesting that that's still there. Maybe it just needs to be. I know one thing that came up in our panel is that the idea of taxonomies are critical. We need words to describe things, and we need categories. Otherwise, we don't know what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But when their harm comes is when those taxonomies have value judgments placed with them. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that really rang true. That was one of our audience, our wonderful audience, had brought that up. And
anyway. It's interesting that all of us kind of touched upon how, it's contemporary often seems to take the hierarchy. I mean, is upper on the is higher on the hierarchy. So it is true that even in India, often it's seen as many other things, since it's an import from the West.
Mm-hmm.
Access to it is usually, I mean, maybe access is not only about, sometimes it's not even conscious, right? It's just about the fact that the class and etc. differences just exist, and hence access is defined by that. So sometimes it's not even a conscious thing like, hey, you can't do this, but just on the basis of the historical classist etc. differences, the access is defined in a way, um, by that. So just a thought on sometimes how access is not deliberately cut off, but is cut off due to historical kind of reasons as well. Because sorry, I just wanted to mention one thing from my panel where one of the dancers, the belly dancer, was trying to um, apply for an empanelment to be recognized, and it was kind of similar. And she's been doing a lot of contemporary work, but she was denied access to any of the categories, firstly, and B, also to the auditoriums. So like one of the biggest cities in India said that she could not perform in the auditoriums because belly dance is to XYZ, like fill in the adjectives, whatever you want. So I think not only access in terms of who can access the dance, but also what are the spaces the dance can access in a way, and the barriers that kind of poses on that.
Yes, like some dances being more legitimate to the stage, to the theater dance stage, and for instance, other dances, perhaps Peruvian dances, more relegated to the popular or the festivity, or so not worth of being in a big theater as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Colleen, any last thoughts?
I just had one more thought about access, and I guess it's because I live in a very fabulously diasporic city, in a place where there's all kinds of dance, and the idea of Western hegemony being a really big thing, where it's what's considered for everybody, and not for everybody. Everybody would have access to it with money, perhaps, or with class, or with a particular look for different forms of dance. What would happen if so many different kinds of dances were absolutely open to everyone? Where there were lessons for everyone. So not that they might become professional dancers, but they might be able to understand it better. Like, I have this dream of all of the Bharatanatyam and Odissi concerts not taking place outside the center of Vancouver in the big theaters, but inside, and lots of people of all different walks of life and colors and shapes and sizes watching it and appreciating it, not feeling like, oh, well, I won't understand the stories, or I won't understand this, or I don't know, I don't get it. That's not for me. And the same thing with all forms of dance. I don't know, how can we make that happen? It would be nice so that everybody felt like there was belonging. Anyway, well, we're pretty close to finishing. Any other thoughts, you guys?
Very good.
There's so much in these panels. There's so much. Anyhow,
I
think if we start, we won't finish. So
it's true.
We'll keep it for the after talk.
Okay. You wrap it up beautifully, Colleen, with this idea of dance is for everyone, dances for everyone. So I want to stay with that message.
Okay. Yeah. It's a good thing for International Dance Day when you guys, we're all from we're all on 3 different continents. I'm just finding, I suddenly realized that, even though of course I knew it. It was like, wow, we're on 3 different continents. Anyhow, so that's it. This is the closing. I'm just going to say thank you to the Dance Center for making this possible, and for allowing a space for us to celebrate International Dance Day virtually across oceans and continents. And thank you to everyone who helped make this possible. If you want more information about this research project, there'll be links coming up in the chat or in the messaging area below. You can always contact us through TomoeArts, but we have a website for the Redefining the Contemporary, so you can check out all the stuff on our panels. There's videos, links to some of the panels, and articles and all of that kind of stuff. So if you want to know more, please check that out. We have a website. There's a number of places. So all of those will pop up. And please send questions or write questions in the chat or even in the Facebook group or Facebook event, and we will try to answer them. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
We have one last little thing to do before we will end it here, so you can move on to the next fabulous Dance Day thing.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks
Here
for
we go.
watching.
Three, 2, 1.